The last Emden to be commissioned in the time period the channel covers was quite the hybrid. With the end of World War I, the Versailles Treaty limited the number and type of ships the German Navy could have, and they could only be replaced once each ship was 20 years old. But since the oldest of the light cruisers in question, the Niobe, had commissioned in 1900, they could start work on a replacement pretty quickly. However, this was complicated somewhat by the splitting up of the German state naval infrastructure, with much of it shut down or handed over to civilian use, along with the shutting down of the Ship Testing Centre in 1920. This forced the remaining few designers to use a mixture of existing design documents as a base. The Köln class, which had actually been completed and was thus known to at least stay upright, and the Flottenkreuzer series of design studies that had never been finished, but which reflected later thinking, even if the individual designs may or may not have worked as designed without some major revisions. The displacement of the new ship was also limited by treaty to 6,000 tons. Now here's where things get a little more difficult, as different scholars disagree over the interpretation of the following sequence of events. One argument is that Emden was to have its main battery in 4 twin turrets all on the centre line from the very start, and actually displaced considerably more than the 6,000 ton limit, with the ship retroactively made legal by adopting the standard displacement measure from the Washington Treaty, which is a different measure of displacement compared to that specified in Versailles. The other interpretation argues that the same documents show Emden's original design was to use single guns, like the designs that she was drawn from, and her original normal displacement was in fact 6,000 tons, but with the new standard displacement reckoning, the ship came in at just under 5,300 tons, and the designers then decided to upgrade the design to use twin turrets and with a more expensive torpedo battery. Given that the former argument relies on the full load displacement being over 6,000 tons, which was never a measure of displacement for the purposes of treaty limitations, and otherwise Emden does in some ways resemble a slightly upgraded Köln, which came in at just over 5,600 tons of normal displacement, I would personally tend to marginally favour the latter interpretation, which is that they hoped to upgrade their design. But in any case, what is agreed is that the Allies, when they looked at the plan, said, nope, you're not allowed to use twin turrets or multi-tube torpedo launchers, and so in an era when everyone else was moving over to multi-gun turrets on the centre line for their cruisers, the new German cruiser, named Emden, was completed with a main battery of 8 single 5.9-inch guns, a pair staggered super-firing forward, a similar pair aft, and 4 guns amidships mounted on the wings, 2 per side, for a total broadside of 6. Initially, anti-aircraft guns were limited to a pair of single 88mm weapons and 4 single torpedo launchers on deck. She displaced 5,600 tons standard, and was capable of just under 30 knots thanks to 46,500 shaft horsepower driving a pair of screws. Armour was a little limited, 2 inches on the belt and just over 1.5 inches at the thickest part of the deck. Laid down at the end of 1921, the state of the German economy was such that she wasn't actually launched until the start of 1925, although she did commission in about 9 months and so was in service at the end of the same year. She then went straight into a career as an at-sea training ship, periodically returning for various changes. Rare early photos at the start of her sea trials show a much simpler, thinner and taller foremast, and the rear funnel being lower than the forefunnel. The foremast was rebuilt to a thicker, shorter and more complex form rather quickly, and the rear funnel was raised within a year of the ship entering service. Picking up a third 88mm gun along the way, Emden spent the rest of the 1920s cruising the world on training missions. Then, at the start of 1932, she was moved over to the main fleet, and shortly thereafter converted from coal to oil-fired boilers, along with shorter funnels as a result. She was then moved back to training at the end of 1934 before being moved back into the active fleet again in 1939, just before the start of the Second World War. At the start of the war, she laid mines, and then, while she was reloading in port, she was hit by a Blenheim bomber that she just shot down. But since she was on paper even less capable than the Königsbergs, she was quickly shifted to the Baltic, until at least it was all hands on deck to invade Norway. Here, she got to watch the brand new Blücher get sunk and the powerful heavy cruiser Lutzow get crippled by a collection of museum-worthy Norwegian shore guns and torpedo launchers, and so she wisely decided she was going to drop her troops off out of gun range. After this campaign, it was back to the Baltic, mostly serving as a training ship, until it was time to invade yet another country, this time the Soviet Union, where she shot at some shore batteries and Russian torpedo boats before going back to training again, although she did acquire some additional anti-aircraft guns at this stage just in case. As the Kriegsmarine service fleet continued to dwindle, she was drafted back to the front lines towards the end of the war, laying mines again and escorting convoys, until she went into dry dock at the end of 1944 for engine repairs. She had to be towed out of dry dock as the Red Army was advancing on Königsberg, where she was at the time. She did manage to get one engine going eventually, limping into Kiel, and was then subsequently hit in multiple Allied bombing raids, so at the end of April she was towed out of Kiel into shallow open water, run aground, and then blown up by her own crew.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.